You're sitting at a kitchen table, or maybe in a waiting room, listening to people talk around you. The conversation jumps from topic to topic. Someone shares something personal without hesitation. Someone else reacts instantly. You notice yourself pausing, choosing your words carefully, deciding whether it's worth adding anything at all. You've always done this, not because you're unsure of yourself, but because speaking has never felt like something you do casually. And when you don't jump in, people sometimes assume you're withdrawn, outdated, or emotionally distant, as if you're quiet means you're not engaged. If you grew up in the 1960s, this experience isn't random. It isn't something you picked up later in life. It's something that formed early, quietly, and consistently. And it's important to say this clearly before going any further. There is nothing wrong with you. You are not slow to adapt. You are not emotionally lacking. What you're experiencing is the long-term effect of growing up in a very specific psychological and cultural environment that shaped how you learned to relate to yourself and to other people. People who grew up in the 1960s are often misunderstood through a modern lens. They're described as closed off, overly serious, resistant to vulnerability, or uncomfortable with emotional language. Sometimes they're labeled as rigid or detached. But these labels ignore the context that shaped those traits, because what looks like emotional distance is often emotional discipline. What looks like restraint is often respect. And what looks like silence is often a deeply ingrained habit of observing before responding. The world you grew up in was full of contradiction. On the outside, there was rapid social change, political tension, cultural upheaval, and a constant sense that the rules of society were shifting. But inside most households, the emotional rules were stable and unspoken. You were taught, directly or indirectly, that feelings were something you managed privately, that you didn't lead with emotion, that you handled problems by enduring them, and that strength meant staying composed, especially when things were difficult. Psychologically, this shapes how the nervous system develops. When a child grows up in an environment where emotional expression is limited or discouraged, the brain adapts by turning inward. Instead of processing emotions out loud, you learn to process them internally. Instead of seeking immediate reassurance, you learn to self-soothe through thought, routine, or responsibility. This isn't emotional suppression in the dramatic sense, it's emotional containment. Your system learned that safety came from control, steadiness, and predictability. Over time, this creates a strong internal monitoring system. You become highly aware of your own reactions. You notice what you feel, but you don't always feel the need to share it. You're comfortable with delayed responses. You don't rush to conclusions. You prefer to think things through before deciding how you feel about them. This becomes second nature, and because it's quiet, it often goes unnoticed by others. Research on emotional regulation suggests that people who grow up in low-expression environments often develop a high tolerance for emotional intensity. In everyday terms, this means you can carry a lot internally without it spilling out. You're less reactive. You're less likely to externalize stress. But that doesn't mean you experience less emotion. In many cases, you experience more, just in a slower, more layered way. This is one reason modern culture can feel overwhelming. Today, emotional expression is fast, public, and constant. People are encouraged to share immediately, react instantly, and process emotions out loud. If your nervous system was shaped around privacy and reflection, this can feel unnatural or even intrusive. Not because you don't value honesty, but because honesty for you was always something that unfolded over time. Responsibility also played a major role. Many people who grew up in the 1960s were taught that feelings came second to duty. You did what needed to be done regardless of how you felt. You didn't wait for motivation. You didn't center your emotional state when there were obligations to meet. Over time, this creates an internal structure where functioning takes priority over feeling. You learned to keep going and to deal with emotions later when there was space. Psychologists sometimes describe this as delayed emotional processing. In simple language, it means your emotions don't disappear, they wait. They're set aside until the environment feels safe enough to acknowledge them. For some people, that happens in solitude. For others, it happens years later, in quiet realizations that arrive without warning. Again, this isn't dysfunction, it's adaptation to the expectations you grew up with. There's also an attentional difference that develops. When words were used carefully and not excessively, you learn to listen closely. You pay attention to tone, timing, and what's implied rather than stated outright. You notice shifts in mood. You sense when something is off, even if no one says it. This makes you perceptive, but it can also make fast, surface-level interactions feel draining or unsatisfying. As this understanding deepens, it's worth acknowledging something gently. There are different ways this pattern can show up. For some people, emotional restraint feels grounding. It creates a sense of inner stability. They feel calm, reliable, and steady in themselves. For others, the same pattern can turn into emotional isolation, not because they don't want connection, but because they never learned how to express vulnerability without feeling exposed or unsafe. This distinction isn't about right or wrong, it's about whether the restraint feels flexible or fixed. When emotional control feels like a choice, it's regulating. When it feels like a rule you can't break, it can become heavy. Some people are quiet because they're centered. Others are quiet because they don't know how to speak without feeling they're doing something wrong. Both experiences are valid, and both can exist within the same person at different times. Reframing this psychologically is important. The traits often associated with people who grew up in the 1960s aren't signs of emotional deficiency. They're signs of a nervous system tuned toward stability. Your reward system learned to value consistency over novelty, depth over display, and endurance over intensity. You're less driven by immediate emotional feedback and more by long-term coherence. That wiring doesn't vanish just because cultural norms change. There are strengths here that rarely get acknowledged: the ability to sit with silence without discomfort, the capacity to remain steady during chaos, the skill of thinking before reacting. These traits don't stand out in environments that reward speed and expression, but they matter deeply in moments that require patience, reliability, and emotional presence without performance. At the same time, understanding your wiring doesn't mean you're locked into it. This isn't about staying the same forever. It's about recognizing why certain things feel natural and others feel exhausting, why constant emotional sharing feels unnecessary, why you might prefer a few deep relationships over many casual ones, why solitude feels restorative rather than lonely. If you've ever felt like the world expects you to be louder, quicker, or more emotionally visible than feels right, that doesn't mean you're behind. It means you were shaped in a different psychological climate, one where strength was quiet, where resilience meant holding things together, where emotions were real but private. There's relief in understanding that. Relief in realizing you're not emotionally underdeveloped or resistant to growth. You're patterned, and patterns can be understood without being judged or erased. As you sit with this, you might start to notice small details in your own life. The way you listen more than you speak, the way you take time before naming how you feel, the way you carry responsibility without complaint. These aren't mistakes. They're adaptations that once served you well, and in many ways still do. And perhaps the quiet question to leave with is this: in what ways has this way of being supported you? And in what ways has it asked you to carry more than you needed to? There's no need to resolve that right now. Simply noticing is enough. Understanding doesn't demand change. Sometimes it just offers clarity. And with that clarity comes the realization that there has always been a reason you're like this, and that reason was never a flaw.